This is the easier-to-read version of John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, retold and narrated by Sara Simpson. Chapter 2. On the ranch, all the men who worked on the farm slept in the bunkhouse. The building was a long rectangle that was just one big room. The room had 8 bunk beds in it, so up to 16 men could stay there at a time. The other men who worked on the ranch were like George and Lenny. They went to a different farm or ranch every couple of months, never staying in one place for very long. There was a big round table in the middle of the room where the men played cards together at the end of the day. An old man named Candy took George and Lenny to the bunkhouse. He showed them which beds they would have. Candy was very old, and he'd lost his right hand in a farm accident a long time ago, so he only had his left hand to use. "The boss was mad at you last night," Candy said to George and Lenny. "He said you were supposed to be here yesterday." George looked carefully at the bed and the little shelf where he and Lenny could put their things. There was a can of lice powder on the shelf. When George saw the can of lice powder, he got angry. "Why's there a can of lice powder here?" George said to Candy. "Are these beds dirty? Are we going to get lice sleeping here?" No, Candy said. "We don't have lice here. The guy who had the bed before you was just paranoid. He was obsessed with being clean. He put the powder around even though there weren't any bugs. When he quit, he forgot to take the lice powder with him." "Why'd he quit?" George asked. "I don't know," Candy said. "He just quit. You know how it is. He just quit. Said he didn't like the food. That's the only reason he gave." George looked carefully at the bed. He looked under the mattress to make sure it was clean. Once George was sure the bed was clean, he unpacked his bag. Lenny watched George and did everything exactly the way George did. "The boss'll be here in a minute," Candy said to George and Lenny. "Like I said, he was really mad that you didn't get here yesterday. He was yelling. He was so mad he give the stable buck hell. The boss screamed at him 'cause he was so mad at you, but the stable buck's an N. Nobody cares if the boss yells at a black guy. If it had been a white guy, he couldn't do that. The stable buck's a nice guy. He didn't deserve it. He does a good job taking care of the horses. He keeps to himself. He likes to read. He's got a lot of books in his room. He has a crooked back where a horse kicked him when he was young. Everyone calls him Crooks because of his crooked back." George knew that stable buck was an offensive name used to describe a black man, but he didn't say anything about it. "What kind of guy's the boss?" George asked. "I know I made him sound mean with that story about the stable buck, but he's actually a nice guy," Candy said. "Last Christmas he brought in a gallon of whiskey for all of us. That was nice of him. We even let Crooks come in to drink with us that night, even though he's black. We don't usually let him come in here because he's black. One of the guys, Smitty, got drunk and wanted to fight Crooks. Crooks won that fight even with his crooked back. After that, the guys all went to Soledad. That's a town near here, and drank all night. Personally, I don't go drinking like that anymore. I'm too old for that." The boss came into the bunkhouse. He was the one who owned the ranch. He was wearing jeans and a cowboy hat just like any other man, but George could tell he was different. His clothes were more expensive, and they were clean. He had metal spurs on his high-heeled boots, which a regular farm worker wouldn't have. He wore them to show that he was the boss and didn't have to work in the fields like the rest of them. "These are the new guys," Candy said. "They just got here." The boss looked closely at George and Lenny. He was trying to figure out if he thought they'd be good workers. "I told the agency I needed 2 men to start first thing this morning," the boss said, looking at the work slips George gave him. "Says here you were supposed to be here first thing today, so it's not the agency's fault. Why were you so late?" "The bus driver let us out too far up the road," George said. "We had to walk 10 miles, that's why we're late." This wasn't true. George and Lenny could have gotten there sooner, but he lied to the boss. "I had to send out the other men without you," the boss said. "That means a lot more work for them. You'll go to work with the team after lunch. What's your name?" "I'm George Milton," George said. The boss pointed at Lenny. "What's your name?" the boss asked Lenny. "His name is Lenny Small," George said. "Where were you working before you came here?" the boss asked. A farm near Weed, George said. What about you? The boss asked Lenny. Yeah, him too, George said. The boss laughed and pointed at Lenny. He doesn't talk much, the boss said. He's quiet, George says, but he's really strong and works hard. Strong as a bull. Strong as a bull, Lenny repeated quietly, smiling to himself. George looked over at Lenny with a look that said, Stop talking. Lenny looked down at his shoes. He was ashamed he had forgotten that he wasn't supposed to talk. Lenny Small, what do you know how to do? The boss asked Lenny. In a panic, Lenny looked at George for help. He can do anything you tell him, George said. He can skin animals to make leather when you're ready to slaughter livestock. He can pick up heavy grain bags and load them. He can drive a tractor. He can do anything. Just give him a chance. The boss looked suspiciously at George. Why don't you let him talk? The boss asked George. What are you trying to get away with? I can tell something's going on. He's not smart, George said, but he's a good worker. He can pick up a hay bale that weighs 400 pounds. George Milton, you seem very interested in Lenny Small, the boss said. What are you doing? You taking his pay away from him or something? No, of course not, George said. Why would you think that? I've never seen one guy interested in helping out another guy unless he was getting something out of it for himself, the boss said. He's my cousin. I told his mom I'd take care of him. He got kicked in the head by a horse when he was a kid. He can work hard. He's not smart, but he can do anything you tell him. He doesn't have to be smart to lift bags of barley and put 'em on a truck, the boss said. But don't try anything, George Milton. I'll be watching you to make sure you're not taking advantage of him. Why'd you quit your job in Weed? The job was done. They didn't need us anymore, George said quickly. He didn't want to give Lenny a chance to say anything about the rape accusations that could get them into trouble. Fine, the boss said. Go out with the team after lunch. They're harvesting barley in the field and they need help putting the bags of grain onto the wagon. You're going to work on Slim's team. He's the big, tall Skinner. You'll meet him when he comes back for lunch. The boss turned and looked at George and Lenny for a long time before he left the bunkhouse. George could tell the boss still didn't trust him. The boss would be watching them both closely, and it made George feel nervous. Once he was sure the boss was gone, George turned to Lenny. You forgot, George said. You weren't supposed to talk. You almost lost us the job. I didn't mean to forget, Lenny said sadly. I tried to remember. The boss is going to be watching us now, George said. Don't do any more talking and make sure you stay out of trouble. George, why did you say I got kicked in the head by a horse? Lenny asked. I didn't get kicked in the head by a horse. I had to explain why you're slow, George said. If I just told him you were born like that, he wouldn't understand. He understands if someone is slow because of an accident. George, why did you say I was your cousin? Lenny asked. I'm not your cousin. I had to explain why I help you, George said. He wouldn't understand if I just told him I helped you because I thought it was the right thing to do. If he thinks I'm your family, he'll understand. Candy, the old man with one hand, came into the bunkhouse. Candy's old dog came with him. The dog was so old he could barely walk. His fur was gray and he couldn't see. Candy helped his dog lay down on the floor in a corner. Were you outside listening? George said to Candy. It's rude to listen in on other people's conversations. I promise I wasn't listening, Candy said. I mind my own business. I don't want to fight with you. George relaxed. Come sit down with us, George said. Your dog is really old. I've had him ever since he was a puppy, Candy said. He used to be a good sheepdog when he was younger. He could make those sheep go wherever he wanted. What'd you think of the boss? He was okay, George said. He seems like he'd be fair. A young man came into the bunkhouse. He was thin and short. He had curly black hair. He was wearing a work glove on his left hand, but he didn't have a glove on his right hand. He was wearing high-heeled boots just like the boss. He was in a bad mood. Have you seen my dad? The young man asked. He was here a minute ago, but he left, Candy said. I think he was going back to the house. I'll look for him there, the young man said. The young man stopped and looked at George and Lenny. When the young man saw Lenny, He made his hands into fists like he wanted to fight. The young man got right in Lenny's face, which made Lenny feel scared. "You must be the new guys," the young man said. "My dad was waiting for you to get here. You were late." "We just got here," George said. "Let the big guy talk," the young man said, looking at Lenny. Lenny looked nervously at George. "Maybe he doesn't want to talk," George said to the young man. "Are you the only one that gets to talk?" the young man asked angrily. "Lenny can talk to you if he wants to," George said. "He doesn't want to." "We just got here," Lenny said quietly. Lenny wouldn't look at the man. He was afraid. "Next time, you need to answer me when I ask you something," the young man said angrily. The young man left the bunkhouse. George watched him leave. "What's that guy's problem?" George asked Candy. "Lenny didn't do anything to him, and he was acting like he wanted to fight him." Candy looked around to be sure the young man was gone and wouldn't hear him. "That's Curly. He's the boss's son," Candy said. "He treats everybody like that. He's always looking for a fight. He was a boxer for a while, and he was pretty good. He's pretty handy." "Lenny didn't do anything to him," George said. "Why does he want to fight Lenny?" "He's like a lot of little guys," Candy said. "He's insecure about being small, and he hates anybody who's bigger than him. Lenny is a big guy, so Curly doesn't like him." "I've met a lot of tough guys," George said. "But Curly needs to leave Lenny alone. Lenny's strong, but he's not smart. If Curly gets into a fight with Lenny, Curly is going to get hurt bad. Lenny doesn't know how strong he is." "In a fight with Curly, the other guy always loses," Candy said. "If it's a big guy who beats up Curly, everyone will say that it wasn't fair for a big guy to beat up a little guy. If Curly beats up a big guy, everyone will make fun of the big guy for getting beat up by a little guy." "Well, he'd better watch out for Lenny," George said. "Lenny ain't no fighter, but Lenny's strong and quick, and Lenny don't know no rules." "Don't tell Curly what I said about him," Candy said. "I'd get fired. Curly will never get fired, because his dad is the boss." "Curly sounds like an asshole to me," George said. "It's been worse lately," Candy said. "Curly got married a couple of weeks ago. He's been angrier than ever since then." "Maybe he's showing off for his wife," George said. "Maybe he's getting into fights to show her how tough he is so he can impress her." "Did you see that glove on his left hand?" Candy asked. "Yeah, I thought it was weird he was only wearing one glove," George said. "Well, that glove's full of Vaseline," Candy said. "Curly says he's keeping that hand soft for his wife. I think what he's doing is showing off to the other guys. Every time they see that stupid glove, they think about how Curly has a pretty wife. It makes him feel like he's better than everybody else." "That's gross," George said. "Wait until you see Curly's wife," Candy said. "She's pretty, but she's always looking at other men. They've only been married 2 weeks, and she's already flirting with other guys. She got the eye. I saw her flirting with Slim. He's a nice guy. She's the one who started it. I saw her flirting with Carlson, too. Well, I think Curly's married a tart. She's a slut." "Curly isn't the first man in the world to marry a slut," George said. Candy started to leave. His old dog followed him slowly and painfully. "Don't tell Curly what I said, okay?" Candy said. "I won't," George said. Candy and his old dog left the bunkhouse. George sat down at the table and started playing solitaire. Lenny watched him. Outside, someone was calling for the stable buck to come get the horses. "Stable buck! Stable buck! Where in the hell is that goddamn inn?" George put the cards down on the table. He looked at Lenny. "Lenny, you need to pay attention," George said. "And this time you need to remember what I tell you. I'm scared. You're going to have trouble with that Curly guy. I've met guys like him before. Today he was testing you. He wanted to see what you'd do if he got into a fight with you. He could tell you were scared, and he's going to fight you the first chance he gets." Lenny looked scared. "Don't let him hit me, George," Lenny said. "I hate guys like Curly," George said. "Lenny, you need to listen. If you get into a fight with Curly, we'll get fired. He's the boss's son. Stay away from him. Don't talk to him. If he comes in a room, you leave. Do you understand? I don't want no trouble, Lenny said. Just stay away from him, George said again. Don't talk to him. I ain't gonna say a word, Lenny said. I don't want you to start a fight with Curly, George said. But if he hits you, go ahead and hit him back. Lenny, do you remember what I told you to do if you get in trouble? If I get in any trouble, you ain't gonna let me tend the rabbits, Lenny said. No, not that part, George said. Do you remember where we slept last night? I want you to go there and wait for me if you get in trouble. Hide in the brush by the river. Repeat it back to me so you don't forget. Hide in the brush by the river. Hide in the brush by the river, Lenny repeated. If you get in any trouble, George said. Repeat that part too. If I get in trouble. If I get in trouble, Lenny repeated. Just keep on saying it to yourself so you don't forget, George said. Just then a girl came and stood in the doorway of the bunkhouse. She was young and pretty, but she wore too much makeup. She had on red lipstick and red nail polish. Her hair was perfectly curled. It must have taken her hours to do her hair. She was wearing a cotton house dress, nothing fancy, but her shoes were bright red heels with red feathers on the toes. The shoes weren't practical for life on a ranch. George didn't see how she was even able to walk in them. I'm looking for Curly, she said. He was in here a minute ago, but he left, George said. Oh, she said, you're the new guys that just got here, right? Yeah, George said. The girl wasn't looking at Lenny, but he was looking at her. She was pretty, and Lenny liked pretty things. I guess I'd better go find Curly, the girl said. Lenny was still staring at the girl, smiling. If I see Curly, I'll tell him you're looking for him, George said. The girl noticed Lenny staring at her and smiled at him. You can't blame a person for looking, she said playfully to Lenny. Slim walked past the girl into the bunkhouse. Hi, Slim, the girl said, flirting. Hi, good-looking, Slim said to the girl. I'm looking for Curly, the girl said to Slim. You're not looking very hard, Slim said. He just walked by. He was looking for you. The girl looked nervous. Goodbye, boys, she said, and left the bunkhouse. Jesus, what a tramp, George said to Lenny. So that's the kind of girl Curly picks for a wife. She's pretty, Lenny said. I don't know how you can tell, George said. She's wearing so much makeup you can't even see her real face. I'll bet she'd leave with the first guy who told her he'd give her $20. She was so pretty, Lenny said. George grabbed Lenny's ear and shook him. Lenny howled in pain. Listen to me, you crazy bastard, George said. Don't you even take a look at that bitch. I've seen girls like her before. She's trouble. I never seen no piece of jailbait worse than her. Do you want to end up in jail? I didn't do nothing to her, George, Lenny cried. You didn't do nothing yet, George said, but I saw you looking at her, and I saw her flirting with you. She don't know you got a mind like a kid. She just sees a big man. Stay away from her. She's a rat trap if ever I saw one. I don't like this place, Lenny said, crying. This ain't no good place. I want to leave. I don't like it here either, George said, but we can't afford to leave. We don't have any money left. We have to stay here until we make a little bit of money. Then we'll leave. We can go north and try to pan gold in the river. Maybe we'll get rich. That sounds good, Lenny said. Come on, George, let's go. It's mean here. We gotta stay, George said. Now be quiet. The other guys are starting to come in. The men were coming in from working in the field. They were going into the bathroom and washing up before dinner. The last man to come in was Slim. He was a perfect cowboy. He looked exactly like the cowboys George had seen on the covers of books. He was tall and muscular with black hair. He was serious and quiet. His hatchet face was ageless. He might have been 35 or 50. He was a jerk-line skinner. It was the most important job on the ranch. All the men wanted that job. The jerk-line skinner was the man who drove the team of mules that pulled the wagon. It was a big responsibility. Only the most skilled men could do the job. He moved with a majesty only achieved by royalty and master craftsmen. He was the prince of the ranch. All the other men wished they could be like Slim. "It's brighter'n a bitch outside," Slim said to George and Lenny. "I can hardly see now that I'm back indoors. You the new guys? You here to help harvest the barley?" "Yes," George said. Slim smiled. "I hope I get you on my team," Slim said. "I've got a couple of guys who don't know what they're doing, and it's making the work hard. You ever bucked barley before?" "Hell yes," George said. "I ain't nothing to scream about, but that big bastard there can put up more grain alone than most pears can." Lenny smiled proudly. Slim looked closely at Lenny. He could tell there was something different about him, but he wasn't sure what it was. "You guys travel around together?" Slim asked in a friendly voice. "Yes," George said. "We kind of look after each other. Lenny isn't smart, but he's a good worker. Hell of a nice fella, but he ain't bright. I've known him for a long time." Slim smiled kindly. "I don't know very many guys who stick together like that," Slim said. "I don't know why. Maybe everybody in the whole world is scared of each other." "I think it's nice to have a friend you can trust," George said. Another man came into the bunkhouse. He had big muscles and a big stomach. "Hi, Slim," the man said. "Are these the new guys?" "They just got here," Slim said. "I'm Carlson," the big man said, shaking George's hand. "I'm George Mitland," George said, "and this is Lenny Small." Carlson laughed and looked at Lenny. "He ain't very small," Carlson said. "Oh, Slim, I meant to ask you, how's your dog? Did she have her puppies yet?" "Lulu had 'em last night," Slim said. "There were 9, but I drowned 4 of 'em right off. She couldn't feed that many. If I didn't do it, they'd all have died. There's 5 left. I kept the biggest, strongest ones. I figure they'll turn out to be some kind of shepherd dogs." "Are you going to keep 'em all?" Carlson asked. "They have to stay for their mother for a little while at least," Slim said. "Why?" "I was thinking about Candy's old dog," Carlson said. "That dog is so old it can't hardly walk. It can't see. It doesn't have any teeth. Candy has to feed it milk. That dog stinks. It smells so bad it stinks up the whole bunkhouse. I think you should get Candy to shoot his old dog and give him one of the puppies." "I'll think about it," Slim said to Carlson. "Come on, we'd better go get some dinner before it's all gone." Slim and Carlson left to go to dinner. Lenny looked at George. He was excited. "Did you hear about the puppies?" Lenny said excitedly. "George, can I have one?" "I'll ask Slim," George said. "I want a brown and white puppy," Lenny said. "I don't know what color they are," George said, "but we'll ask." "You ask him right away, George, so he don't kill no more of 'em," Lenny said. "Okay, I'll ask him right away," George said. "Now come on, we need to go eat dinner." Just then Curly stomped into the bunkhouse. "You seen a girl around here?" Curly demanded angrily. "About 30 minutes ago," George said. "Well, what was she doing?" Curly demanded. "She said she was looking for you," George said. Curly looked at George carefully. He was looking at George to see if he thought he would win in a fight. "Which way did she go?" Curly asked. "I don't know, I didn't watch her go," George said. Curly stomped out. George looked at Lenny. "I'm scared I'm going to get into a fight with that bastard," George said. "He acts like he's ready to fight all the time. I hate guys like that." George and Lenny left to go eat dinner. Once all the men were gone, Candy's old dog slowly came into the bunkhouse. He found a comfortable spot in the corner, laid down, and went to sleep.
Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe and click on the link for more resources from Enraged2Engaged.